Having worked with Twitter for 8 years, how did the company grow during your time as UK Managing Director and VP EMEA?
Yeah, when I first joined Twitter, there was around 400 people working at the company globally, and it was a tiny little endeavor. In fact, people routinely used to ask, how will this ever make money? It felt more like a college project than a business. So in the course of that time, of course, it massively changed. When I first joined Twitter, it was famous really for Stephen Fry and Jonathan Ross and little else in the UK. Obviously, over the course of time, it started wrestling with issues that none of us had ever imagined, including sort of societal impact or impact on politics and the sort of discourse of society. So fundamentally changed. And I think the critical thing about that was a sort of constant reappraisal, what you often find in tech companies anyway. And I'm always cautioned to caveat that tech companies aren't as different as other companies as they try and pretend. But the one thing you'll find in tech companies is that there's a real celebration of quarters. It tends to be like, what can you accomplish in the next 13 weeks? And then you start again. And most definitely, that's probably one of the most vivid differences. So, I worked for 8 years at Twitter, and probably one way to think about that is 32 quarters rather than 8 years, because it was constant sense of reinvention and renewal.
And similar question, you saw YouTube gain popularity between 2008 and 2013. How has the platform impacted the entertainment industry?
Yeah, it's worth saying when I first started working at YouTube, the feeling very much was that Google had just bought it. The feeling very much with inside Google was that it would never make money. In fact, it became famous for a couple of things. It became famous for being regarded as probably so expensive to run that only Google could even afford to own it. And secondly, the content was renowned as Charlie Bit My Finger and dogs on skateboards. And so as a consequence of that, a lot of people said this will never go anywhere. Now, I was just drawn to the fact that I was just increasingly tantalized by the fact that anything you wanted to find, you could find there. And so whether it was archive footage of old TV music performances, or whether it was tutorials by people, there was an increasing amount coming on. There wasn't such thing as a YouTuber at the time, so there wasn't this whole ecosystem. But I was just convinced that, wow, look at this extraordinary explosion of creativity. In fact, there was a time where Beyonce had released a new video, and she and the dancing was really celebrated on her video. And she was asked about it in an interview. She doesn't do a lot of interviews, Beyonce. She was asked about it, and she said, "Oh yeah, we just found some dancers on YouTube, and so we just copied that." And it was just really interesting how effectively the platform had become this connective tissue between elements of culture, and that can be a frustration. I remember going to Brazil a couple of years ago, and I was really struck by how similar to the European cities that we're familiar with, how similar it was. I think sort of the internet has served to probably bridge some of the differences, the cultural divides. But also, platforms like YouTube are incredible for taking an idea and propagating it. The biggest song in the world now is generally the biggest song everywhere in the world, which is pretty unique for the last 15 years, really.
So following the rapid digitalization caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, what do you predict will be the next big thing to disrupt businesses?
Yeah, I think the big debate that's going to happen in the next 2 years is a discussion about hybrid working, because I think we're going to realize pretty quickly, and it's going to be a degree of emperor's new clothes. No one's going to want to admit that hybrid working isn't really effective for a long while, because we want to make some concession to the way things are working. But gradually we're going to be sitting in rooms where some people are going to be on video calls, some people are going to be on the screen, and there's going to be a dawning realization, this just isn't working. And at that point, firms are going to be presented with a choice. Do they demand that people come back to the office 4 days a week and try and make this work? Or do they say, right, let's start with basic principles. Let's try and work out how we can get the job done productively. There's a fantastic person in the real estate market, a guy called Anthony Slumbers. And Anthony Slumbers evokes a very famous Stanford professor, a guy called Clayton Christensen. Clayton Christensen does this, he talks a lot about innovations theory. And the way he talks about innovations theory is he says that no one owned a drill to own a drill. You don't buy a drill because you want to own a drill. You buy a drill because you want a hole in the wall, and you want a hole in the wall because you want to put a shelf on it. Right. So you do think something. And Anthony Slumber says no one bought an office to own an office. People bought an office to have a productive workforce. And I think the closer we start to that, then we can start saying, okay, so we want a productive workforce. Well, if our team currently are burnt out, or if they're demotivated, or maybe we believe they're skiving off. Maybe we believe they're not working. Then let's start with, how do we make sure they're working? How do we make sure they're motivated? How do we make sure they're inspired? Rather than, how do we make sure they're traveling for 2 hours a day to come and sit in an office? That's not what we need. That's just what we learned. And so I think the more that we can start with the end in mind, the more we're going to find a really satisfying, forward-facing solution for this.
And do you personally have hope for a sustainable future? And if so, why?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I do. But I think it's going to be it's going to be like a fingertip finish in terms of how close we're getting. We've had, over the last few years, there's been record numbers of forest fires, and it won't have escaped anyone's attention that this year was a record year. We're seeing just the most remarkable images of climate change affecting all of us. I was only looking this morning at a French motorway that flooded with a storm surge of water. That, these freak weather incidents are happening more and more. And like I say, we're in this extraordinary situation where, for the first time, the economics of renewables pretty much beat anything. Solar power has been declared the cheapest energy in history. So these things are just remarkable for us, but we mustn't dawdle. We've got to get to a stage where, rather than saying, well, we're seeking to enact change over the next 30 years, we've got to challenge ourselves and say, well, could we shift the whole of the UK grid to renewables in 10 years? And the answer is definitely yes. What would that do? The adage that came in the US election is that anytime you hear renewables, anytime you hear green power, what you should also hear is jobs, because these jobs are providing, small power, solar across the whole of the UK. There's also jobs in providing charging points across the whole of the UK. We just don't have the infrastructure for it at the moment. But if we said we're going to enact a transformation, where I live, they've just introduced charging points in lampposts, which I think is just the most incredible use of existing infrastructure. But we just need more of that. We just need the appetite where everyone says, actually, we're really excited about how we can exceed expectations. And I think that, for me, is the challenge of this moment. It's a moment for optimists really to sort of impress upon us the need to get things done quickly.